Hello everyone. In this video, I'll be discussing about how ASM maintains redundancy by placing its mirrored extent copy on its partner disk and how many partners each disk can have. As I already discussed in my previous video about the partnership status table, PST contains information about every disk that is part of a disk group. It contains information like the disk number and its partner disk and the status of the disk, failure group, and heartbeat information. Every disk group has its own PST. ASM provides redundancy by placing mirrored extent copies on its partner disk in other failure groups. For example, if I have a normal redundancy disk group with two failure groups, when we are creating a normal redundancy disk group and if we are not defining the failure group at the time of creation, by default, every disk is placed in its own failure group. That means in this current slide, D1 itself is a failure group and D2 itself is a failure group. So for every primary extent on D1 can have its mirrored extent copy on D2, and for every primary extent on D2 can have its mirrored extent copied on D1. So for a normal redundancy disk group with two failure groups, D1 is partner for D2 and for D2, D1 is its partner. But what if we have a normal redundancy disk group with three failure groups? Now in this case, for D1, D2 and D3 are partners, for D2, D1 and D3 are partners, and for D3, D1 and D2 are partners. For every disk, it can have maximum of 8 partner disks. So for every primary extent in this normal redundancy disk group, for a primary extent on D3 can have its mirrored copy on its D1 or D2, but not on both. So in this slide, we can see that the primary extent on D3 has its mirrored extent copied on D2, but not on D1. As a normal redundancy specifies, only one copy of the primary extent is maintained in other failure groups. Similarly, for high redundancy disk group with three failure groups, for every primary extent on D1 has its mirrored extent copied on D2 and D3. For every primary extent on D2, it can have its mirrored extent copied on D1 and D3, and for D3, for every primary extent on D3 can have its mirrored extent copied on D1 and D2. So in high redundancy, for D1, D2 and D3 are its partners, and for D2, D1 and D3 are its partners, and for D3, D1 and D2 are its partners. But what if we have four failure groups that are D1, D2, D3, D4 are part of high redundancy disk group? So in this case, for every primary extent on D1 can have its mirrored copies on any other two failure groups, but not the three. So in this case, for a primary extent on D1 can have its mirrored extent copies on D3 and D4. And similarly, a primary extent copy on D3 can have its mirrored extent copies on D1 and D2, but not on all other three failure groups. So with this, we conclude that for every disk in a failure group can have up to a maximum of 8 partner disks. So irrespective of failure groups that are part of the disk group, only if it is a normal redundancy disk group, only one copy of the primary extent is maintained in other failure groups, and in case of a high redundancy disk group, only 2 copies of the primary extent are maintained in the other available failure groups. Now let's try to find the same information